All right, welcome back for session 3 of the Old Testament survey. Once again, my name is Pastor Jason Huffman, and glad you're back with us here today. We've been going through Genesis and talking about the primeval period, if you remember from the last time we met. That's the period of time before the flood, with the antediluvians and all the long lifespans and all of that. And so, by way of review, I just want to write out for you, remembering kind of the context of how to remember Genesis and the way that Genesis is broken down. Remember, Genesis could be divided into two sections, chapters 1 through 11, which contain those four major events. And hopefully by now you're able to remember those. One being creation. Two, obviously, is the fall. Number 3, the flood. Talked about Noah and the first appearance of grace on the scene in the Word of God. Great stuff there. And then 4 being the Tower of Babel. We finished with that last time, Tower of Babel, and talked about Nimrod and different things like that. Before we get into the next section of Genesis there, I do want to mention, in talking in the context of the Tower of Babel, really we see a pattern, and I wanted to point this pattern out to you. Like with Cain, who determined and chose for himself the way in which he was going to approach God in worship, and then like just the world as a whole, in the context of the way in which the condition of the world at the time of the flood. And we looked in Matthew chapter 24 how Jesus said, man, the days of the time of Noah, it's going to be like that in the time right before I return a second time to make all things new. Well, the people there had really just chosen their own way, and gone around to do their own thing. And even with Adam and Eve, choosing their own will above God, it's been kind of a theme that we've been talking about. And then this character Nimrod, unifying the people and bringing them together in an open rebellion against God to choose their own will against Him. I want you to think of it in this way, in the context of worship. God is looking for those who worship Him in spirit and in truth, right? And so much in today's day, we talk with people, maybe there's some people in your life that are confused about God, confused about what God expects, confused about how to even get into a relationship with God or to approach God, what's acceptable to Him, what's not. And there is a way in which God has established that He wants us as His created beings to approach Him in worship. And from the beginning of time, from the dawn of time, whether it's Cain and Abel, if you go to Jude, it says, do not take the way of Cain, and all of that. Do not follow in the way of Cain or Korah or in Balaam. And so it talks about this way of Cain and what that is. And quite simply, what I'm trying to say is that it's the way in which you determine that you're going to reach God the way you decide, right? So in the context of worship, I'll worship God the way I want to worship God. I'll respond and be in a relationship with God the way I want to respond and be in a relationship with God. And then that's so like our culture today, is that people choose, a grab bag of religion, and man, okay, well, I like that part of that religion, I like this part over here, and so I'll create my own way to approach God. Even I'll create my own way to find salvation, and I'll create my own way, to worship whatever God I've established. It's idolatry. And we see that in the context of the Tower of Babel, really it was them building this tower to the heavens. The earth had just been flooded, kind of saying, okay, God, if you flood the earth again, guess what? We got this tower. We're going to get to the top, and we outsmarted you. And then also as a sense of building this tower to the heavens to create a sense of worship to reach God, or whatever God, they were going to put as the focus of their attention. And it's a representation of man's attempt to create his own path to God. Wow. You know what? That's really a simple definition of what false religion is. Religion that is not the gospel, that is not Jesus, the way, the truth, and the life, is really just man's attempt to create their own path to God. And we see that really founded and started at the Tower of Babel. Really, some could argue the source of all false religion in the earth. And so now what we're going to do is get to the second part of Genesis here, and we'll finish out today our study in Genesis and Old Testament survey and get on to the next part of history here. But if Genesis 1 through 11 dealt with 4 epic events, then Genesis 12 through 50, remember, dealt with 4 characters. And I mentioned it quite a few times, and hopefully you probably know it by now. It's Abraham. So he's the first one. We're going to talk about him today. Isaac, Jacob. Oh, my name's Jason, so I write an S. It's just habit. Jacob, and of course Joseph, and his coat of many colors. So that's basically Genesis right there. So what we're going to do is talk about today is we're going to talk about Abraham. Abraham in Genesis chapter 12, really after the flood, opens a new dawn of history, a new era for mankind. And we were in the primeval period. Now we transition into what's known as the patriarchal period because it deals with the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the patriarchs of our faith. And so we're going to talk about them in this new era, in this new period. So it's a real shift in Genesis. You know, if you read through Genesis, and you'll catch that, wow, things really kind of changed here between chapter 11 and chapter 12. It's a radical thing. But we find the context of Abraham's world right before God calls him and selects him is similar to the context of the way in which sin affects humanity. That mankind has drifted away from God, that God is not first, they're elevating their own will above his, and all of those things. And even to the point of, when you read in passages like in Joshua chapter 24 and verse 2 through 3, it lets us know that in Abraham's day, Abraham was part of a family and a culture that worshipped false idols. They were a culture of idolatry. Really, it was a culture of polytheism. So a polytheistic mentality. Basically, that means multiple gods, polytheism, versus the worship that Judaism is, which would be monotheism, worship of one God. So Abraham arrives on the scene in the context of our story here in a very polytheistic culture. He comes from a family. His father's name's Terah, T-E-R-A-H, and he's a man who's just very accustomed to worshiping many gods and stuff like that. And so what God does in Genesis chapter 12, and if you have your Bible, you can turn there and just kind of keep it open. I'll be referencing different verses back and forth here, is that prior to that, towards the end of chapter 11, it says in verse 27 that Terah, Abraham's father, became the father of Abram. Abram would later have his name changed to Abraham. And then it says that Abram marries. He has a wife named Sarai. Sarai was barren. And then in verse 1 of chapter 12, it says, the Lord had said to Abram to go, leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you. And then God establishes and enters into this covenant with this man, Abram. Now, there's a lot of significant things to understand here about Abram, the context of the culture, and the context of God in relationship to this man. The first is that Abram, as it's implied here, had been told. You see, it says God had said to Abram to leave his country and to leave his family and to go to a place that he was going to show him. If you remember the geography map that I drew, Abraham was from that Ur area, which is down around the Persian Gulf. And he traveled up probably the Tigris and Euphrates River, because that would be a great way to travel back in the ancient days, you know, along the waterways, and ended up, instead of going to Canaan, which was Israel, that we know as Israel today, instead of going all the way there, because now we're looking back and we know that that's where God's taking him, he kind of stops up here at the place where the Tigris and the Euphrates get close, in a village or a city called Haran. Now, he stays there until his father passes away. And then we find after his father dies, he makes his way finally into the land of Canaan. Now, God's covenant with Abram in Genesis chapter 12 is really the cornerstone of the Old Testament, maybe one of the cornerstone chapters of the entire Bible, because it's God's covenant with this man to make a nation out of him, and through that nation to bring the Messiah, and through the Messiah to complete the redemptive plan, to get us back to that place where it's us in relationship with God, the way he created it in the Garden of Eden. And so Abraham ends up camping out in Haran until his father dies. You know what's interesting is Abram's father's name, Terah, actually literally means delay. So we see that it isn't until Abram finally makes his way over to Canaan that God reaffirms his covenant with him about he's going to make him a blessed nation. He's going to give him descendants as many as the stars and the sands of the ocean and all of those things. We'll look a little bit closer at the Abrahamic Covenant when we get to that. Not only Abram's father goes with him, but actually Abraham's nephew. And you may know who that is. That's Lot. You're familiar with Lot and his wife, Sodom and Gomorrah, and his wife turns back and looks at the cities as they're being destroyed. She turns to a pillar of salt. You're familiar with that. What's fascinating about this context of these two guys here in the patriarchal period is that I'd like to show and share with you the contrast between these two characters. Now, what I want to point out is really the character or the integrity of the men themselves, and then how, in contrast, they really communicate to you and me here today, thousands and thousands of years later, how God responds to us as human beings, what God requires of us, and then also how we're to approach this life with a filter, with a sense, with a concept, with a real grasp of faith. Now, the Bible talks about Abraham, and Abraham was blessed, and he was accredited righteousness because he believed God's promises for him, because he had faith. And so we're going to look closer at these things here as we look at the contrast of Abraham and Lot. All right, so let's look at Abraham and Lot. Abraham, obviously, as we know, looking back, a well-known character in the Bible, really one of the most incredible, pivotal figures, not only in Judaism, in the Hebrew faith, but also in the Islamic faith. He's the father of Ishmael, and even in Christianity. So really an epic father in human history. But some of the things about Abraham were he was blessed and prosperous because of the way in which he responded to God in his life. He was obedient, and he lived this pattern of obedience. We can see that even in his actions. If you read Abraham's story, everywhere he went, he was building altars to God, building altars to God. And what is an altar, really? An altar is that meeting place between us and God. It's that context and that place of worship between us and God, and that place in which we reaffirm and remind ourselves and glorify God that we are His creation, and that He is our Creator, and that He's a sovereign God, and He's over everything, and we can trust Him. It's an expression of faith and worship to God. Everywhere Abraham went, he was building altars here and building altars there, because he was constantly reminding himself and constantly worshiping and glorifying God for what God had done in his life. But we can see an incredible contrast between him and his nephew Lot. Now, his nephew Lot traveled with him from Ur all the way up to Haran, and then, of course, Terah, Abram's father, died. And then Lot decides to go with him into Canaan and goes on this faith journey with Abraham. But as you begin to study the life of Lot and Abraham, we see that once they get to Canaan, they become so prosperous in Genesis chapter 13 that the two of them, their servants and their cattle, their sheep, they can't coexist in the same place. They start to bicker and fight with one another. And so what Abraham decides to do is he decides to make a decision and ask Lot to separate from him. Now remember, Abraham's the uncle and Lot's the nephew. Abraham's the older and the one who carries the authority. But here's something interesting. Instead of Abraham going to Lot and saying, look, man, our families aren't getting along together. What I want you to do is take all your stuff and head on out over that way, and I'm going to stay here, or something to that effect. I mean, Abraham had all the authority to do that. You know, he's the uncle. But instead what Abraham does in Genesis chapter 13 is something very different. So let's look at this. It says that in verse 8, so Abram said to Lot, let's not have any quarreling between you and me, or between your herdsmen and mine, for we're brothers. Is not the whole land before you? So, let's part company. If you go to the left, I'll go to the right. If you go to the right, then I'll go to the left. Then Lot looked up and saw that the whole plain of the Jordan was well watered, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt toward Zoar. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So he's looking out over the area where Sodom and Gomorrah are. Verse 11, so Lot chose for himself the whole plain of the Jordan and set out toward the east. The two men parted company, and Abram lived in the land of Canaan, while Lot lived among the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. Do you notice there that Abram, instead of saying, Lot, you know what? It's not working out, man. Love you to death. You got to split. He had the right to do that, right? Instead, he approached Lot and in humility said, you know what? It's not working out, but let's do it this way. You choose whichever direction, whichever you want. Look around and choose what you want, and I'll go the opposite direction. You know what that communicates to us? Is that Abraham was really a man of faith. That Abraham understood that God's blessings were not dependent upon where he was in life. That God's blessings were something that were given to him by God's grace, and that if he went to the left, God was going to bless him. If he went to the right, God was going to bless him. It didn't really matter because he had God's favor and blessing over his life because he had chosen to respond in faith. Now, Lot, on the other hand, we see that he had a very different response. When he was taken to the place to choose the land, it says that he looked up and he saw with his own eyes, and he chose for himself the land that looked good to him. What a radical different contrast between Abraham. Like, it doesn't matter where I go, I know God's going to bless me, with Lot making a decision based upon his sight. How much, have you in your life maybe been challenged with the decision, like, okay, God, I don't know what to do, and been tempted to use your eyes or your own faculties, your own perception of the world, that which is physical, to determine, okay, God, maybe this is what you want me to do, instead of allowing and following the path of Abraham and just say, okay, God, I know I'm blessed. I know that you have your grace and favor over me. And so it doesn't matter what way I go. You open the doors for me, I'll go through them. If the doors don't open, I'm not going to go through them. I trust and have faith in you, God. You see the difference really in the two? And their stories end so differently too. Abraham goes, he camps in Canaan, and he makes mistakes. And we'll talk about one of those big epic mistakes very soon. And Lot goes and goes to where he sees would be a great place to establish himself. And we know it becomes Sodom and Gomorrah. And then when God comes to judge Sodom and Gomorrah, Abraham is his friend. Abraham is a man of faith. He even comes to Abraham and says, look, I'm thinking about destroying these cities. What do you think about that, Abraham? And Abraham says, man, would you do it? You wouldn't do it if righteous people were there. Begins to barter with God about the righteous people, because he knows that Lot, his nephew, and his nephew's families are in Sodom and Gomorrah. And God says, you know what, I'm not going to destroy him if there's just 10 righteous people. And angels are sent to get Lot and his family out, because there aren't enough righteous people to prevent God's judgment on them. And we see that in Hebrews it talks about Lot in chapter 11, a righteous man. And yet he's in Sodom and Gomorrah in this wicked context, in this wicked generation, wicked environment, and he's been completely limited in his ability as a witness. When the angels come, the men of the city come out to call the angels out. And Lot says, man, you don't want to do that. These people have come. They're people in my house. You know what? Take my daughters instead. It's like, what? If Lot is a righteous man, as the New Testament says in Hebrews, how far is he from the reality of living a fulfilled life when he's got to make these kind of crazy decisions? Or then the angels say, you know what? God's going to destroy the city. Get your family and get out. And Lot goes to his son-in-laws who are about to marry his daughters. They haven't married yet. They're about to marry his daughters. And he said, God's going to destroy the city. Let's go. And his future son-in-laws, they laugh at him. He's got no authority. He's completely limited and diminished as a man of God and his authority in God, because he's been consumed by the environment, because he started out not in faith, but choosing with his own abilities, his own eyes. And so not only that, but the story gets even worse for this poor character. He ends up getting out of the city. His wife is turned into a pillar of salt. And the angels say, we want you to go into the caves, because that's where we're going to direct you to be saved. And Lot says, I don't want to go to the caves. I'll die if I go to the caves. Let me go to this little city over here. And the angels are like, fine, go to the little city. That's not where we wanted to take you. But if that's what, once again, you want to do, go ahead and do what you want to do. Lot goes there. He actually ending up in the caves where he was supposed to be in the first place. He's in these caves with his two daughters. And what ends up happening is his two daughters are so worried that they're not going to have generations to carry on their father's name, that they end up having relations with their father. They both become pregnant, and they give birth to two nations, the Moabites and the Ammonites, who are God's people's enemies for almost the entire duration that Israel is in the Old Testament. And that is where Lot's story ends, in a cave, in this context, in this horrible situation. What a dramatic contrast to Abraham, who started out obeying God and said, you know what, God, I'm going to trust you. I know that you're going to bless me. It doesn't matter about the details. I know you've got your hand on my life. And Abraham began to walk that out. And it was because of that spirit inside of Abraham that God established this covenant with him. Listen to some of the things of the Abrahamic covenant that God said to Abraham. I will make you a great nation. In other words, I'm going to make you a father of multitudes, multiple nations. He says, I will bless you, Abraham. Abraham's going to prosper materially, right? And we see that. Abraham was so prosperous. God says to him, I'll make your name great. Abraham's descendants are going to be promised from generation to generation to have greatness. He says to Abraham, I'll make you a blessing. You will be a blessing. So those that even Abraham associates with are going to be blessed simply because of this. He says that I'll even bless those, Abraham, that bless you, and curse those that curse you. This is an incredible covenant that God is making with Abraham. And then finally he says to Abraham, in you all the families of the earth will be blessed. You know, within that part of this covenantal promise is the reality of the Messiah. That, you know what? The Messiah is going to come through Abraham, and everybody on the face of the earth, both Jew and Gentile, will experience the blessing of God through the redeeming power of what Jesus Christ did on the cross, and that blood was shed for all mankind if we would just respond in faith like Abraham and receive by grace that which God has established for us through his Son, Jesus Christ. Powerful, powerful covenant. This covenant kind of sets the cornerstone and the foundation for the entire nation of Israel. The nation of Israel is founded out of this one man, Abraham. God selects this one person, says, I'm going to make a covenant with you, and then boom, we're off to find the nation of Israel that is formed out of Isaac and Jacob, his sons. Now here's something really important to realize too. This word, which is a theological term and an idea, which is the word election. Election simply means, in the context of Abraham, that it was nothing within Abraham that drew God to him as far as to make him righteous or to make him more acceptable or to make him the one that would do something that God had asked him to do. That God looked down and chose by his own divine providence through election that Abraham would be the man that he was going to enter into a covenant with. And that Abraham's responsibility was to respond in faith. And we see that that relationship was built out of that. And in the same way, even today, that it's not about who you are as far as what you've done, that it's about God's call on your life and God's grace to empower you to do what God has called you to do. And so I love that the way in which Abraham experienced God, we too can experience God and respond to his calling on our life. All right, so with Abraham and this covenant with him, there's a significant thing that takes place between him and God. God says, okay, I'm going to make a covenant with you. But one of the signs, the ratifying factors, one of the things that's going to seal this covenant, this sign that I want you to respond to me, is circumcision. Now, I'm not going to explain circumcision to you because, quite frankly, I might get embarrassed and it make me a little uncomfortable. So if you don't know what that is, ask whomever is sharing this video with you, but I think we all understand what that is. And it was this idea that this was going to be the cutting of flesh to seal this covenant between Abraham and his God. And it was to be passed down from generation to generation. Now, this is a physical circumcision, a physical cutting away of the flesh, right? And in the context of the day of Jesus, there were the teachers that were so consumed. And even when you get into the New Testament and with Paul constantly, read the book of Galatians. I love Paul's attitude, and we really get a glimpse into his character when in Galatians he gets so fed up with this talk of physical circumcision that he goes to the extremes and says, I wish they would just cut the whole thing off and be done with it. Because Paul understood that, yes, God sealed this covenant with Abraham in a physical way, but it was only a type, it was only a shadow, it was only meant to get us to the point where Jesus was going to fulfill it for all mankind. That physical circumcision was valuable in the context of the old, but in the new, there's a greater circumcision. Turn, if you would, to Jeremiah chapter 31 and verse 31, and we'll see a prophetic word out of the New Testament of the new covenant and this idea of circumcision. So Jeremiah prophesies in verse 31 of chapter 31, he says, the time is coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. This new covenant was in contrast to the Abrahamic covenant that he's referencing here. It will not be like the covenant I made with their forefathers, the patriarchs, when I took them by the hand to lead them out of Egypt, referring to Moses, because they broke my covenant, though I was husband to them, declares the Lord. This is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after that time, declares the Lord. I will put my law in their hearts, and I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people. And Paul further expounds upon that idea, saying that in the new covenant, in today, the circumcision of the new covenant is not a circumcision of the flesh. It's a circumcision of our heart. It's that old flesh, that old part that used to be part of who we are, allowing the Holy Spirit and the revelation of God to cut that away and make us a new creation. Down the new covenant, all of us can be sons and daughters of Father Abraham because we've been grafted in and we've been a part of this circumcision of the heart, not a circumcision of the flesh. But it's important to understand that in the Abrahamic covenant. And that's why the Hebrew nation passed down from generation to generation for thousands of years. Even today, they follow the traditions of circumcision after the child is born. Jesus himself was circumcised. Now, Abraham and his wife Sarah, they desperately wanted to have a child. God had promised that he would make Abraham's descendants, into a multitude of nations. And yet Abraham seemed to have a problem with having kids. As a matter of fact, it was Sarah who was barren. The Word of God tells us that she was barren. Now, isn't that interesting that God would promise something so epic to Abraham and then put him in this context where him and his wife were unable to have a child? Like, okay, God, have you ever wondered in your life, what in the heck is going on here? You promised me something, and it is totally not working out. As a matter of fact, I don't even see how in the world you're going to connect these dots. It's impossible, right? Sarah's like, I can't have children. This isn't going to work out. Okay, Abraham, maybe God said those things to you. I'm not saying he didn't. Just kind of implying some things here, but I can't have kids. And so Sarah comes up with this idea, which was not that odd in the culture of the day and age of the Old Testament, which was, hey, I have a servant. Her name is Hagar. She's my handmaiden. Because I can't have children, let me give her to you, because the worst thing that could happen here is that, Abraham, you die and you don't have a son to carry on your name. And so instead of me, because I can't have children, why don't you go ahead and take my handmaiden and see if you can have children with her. And that's what they do. I don't know about you, but Abraham is like, all right, I guess I'll try that out, It's kind of we don't understand it from the context of our culture, but in that culture it wasn't that odd. But really it's like, you think of, okay, Abraham, here you are, you have this faith to believe for the impossible. Leave your home, leave your people, go to Canaan. You have this faith to believe that no matter what you do, God's going to bless you, lot you choose. And yet here we see that Abraham makes this epic mistake, and he decides to go ahead and try to have a child with Hagar. It's not uncommon for you and I to experience the same thing. Now, hopefully, if you're married, this isn't happening in your relationship. If it is, contact a pastor near you. But what we see is the principle in relationship here, but in the context of this here, is that Abraham knew that God had promised him something. And Abraham, instead of being patient and trusting in God and waiting for these things to come to pass, he felt like it wasn't going to happen, and he tried to fulfill God's promises on his own power. Did you hear that? Abraham tried to fulfill God's promises in his life on his own power. I still do that today sometimes. You probably still do that. And look what happens. They have a beautiful son, and Abraham loves his firstborn son. His name is Ishmael. Ishmael grows up, becomes a mighty warrior. Ishmael becomes the father of all the Arabs. Today, you could trace back all the Muslim nations, Islam, and all of those, many of those go back to Ishmael. But it wasn't God's chosen way to fulfill his promise. God had established, and God wanted to do something incredible through Abraham. And it was actually in the context of the barrenness of their marriage that God wanted to move. Why would God establish barrenness in their marriage? Because I think that God wanted to say, you know what? I've made an incredible promise that it's part of my redemptive plan. It's part of my divine purpose for your life, Abraham. And you know what? Nobody's going to take the glory from me. I'm going to accomplish this on my own power and in my own time. And when the time came, Isaac was born to them, the beloved son, born to Sarah, even though she was barren. Get this, Sarah was 100 years old. When angels came to tell Abraham, don't worry, man, Ishmael's great, you're still going to have a son, Sarah laughed. That's why Isaac's name actually means laughter, because they named him Isaac because they're like, you can't be serious. How can I have a child, God? I'm 100 years old. I'm well past the childbearing age. And Abraham was so, actually I flipped that around. Abraham was 100 years old and Sarah was 90 years old. I mean, still 90 years old. You're not going to have any kids at 90. But God was saying, it's up to me. I'm going to fulfill this promise. And that's exactly what he did. So Isaac is born to Abraham and Sarah. Now, he's an incredible son, but we don't know much about him. There really isn't a lot in the Old Testament about this character, Isaac. It kind of jumps through to the place where he gets paired up with his wife, Rachel, and then they have sons, and one of their sons' name is Jacob, and we'll get to that. But it's interesting that there's not a lot about Isaac in the Bible. The Scripture tells us very little about him, but one of the most incredible pictures of a prophetic glimpse into Jesus' sacrifice comes from the very life of Isaac. You see, Isaac was the one and only beloved son, like Jesus. And Abraham is in this relationship with God, and God comes to him and says, Abraham, you know what? I want you to sacrifice your one and only beloved son. Wow. You know, God, he's the promise. You gave him to me. Sarah's, you know, she's almost 100 now. Maybe it's believed that Isaac probably was in his early teens possibly when this happened. So Sarah's probably 110 years old. She's not going to have any more kids. This is the promise, God. Why would you have me sacrifice? But Abraham doesn't argue with God. He says, okay, God, I'm going to do it. And the Bible even says that Abraham gets up early the next day and sets off to where God had instructed him to go to sacrifice his one and only beloved son. So you know what? Let's actually go there. And so in Genesis chapter 22, I'm going to read this out of the Bible. In verse 6, it says that Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering, placed it on his son Isaac, and so they're going to carry this here. And he himself held the knife, and the two of them went together. And in verse 7 it says, Isaac spoke up and said to his father, Abraham, Father. And Abraham says, yes, my son. He says, you know, Dad, the fire and the wood are here, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Now listen to this language. Abraham answered, I'm reading out of the NIV, says, but God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. Have you ever wondered, even in the way in which God communicated to Abraham there, he's saying to Abraham, to Isaac, Abraham is, and then God saying through him, but I myself will provide the offering. Remember, this whole story is a typical picture of Jesus Christ, Isaac being a type of Jesus Christ. And this whole picture is this picture of Jesus Christ being the one and only beloved Son offered as a sacrifice for all mankind. And here God is saying, I myself will provide a lamb. Another thing that's interesting, this is the first time in the Bible the word lamb in the Hebrew there shows up. Once again, that first mention of God mentioning a lamb for the first time in the context of this sacrifice with Abraham and Isaac. And another interesting thing too that kind of continues to paint this picture is that Isaac, as we see here, he didn't struggle, he didn't fight. He was, as the Bible says, like a lamb led to the slaughter, as it is said of Jesus Christ. So God does provide a sacrifice. There's a ram caught in the bushes, and that's what Abraham ends up sacrificing, because God never intended for Abraham to offer his son. He was just testing Abraham to see if Abraham would trust him enough to fulfill his blessings in his life. Can you trust God enough to fulfill his blessings in your life? Can you be like Abraham and just respond in faith? You don't have to be perfect. Abraham messed up plenty of times. He would go to Egypt when he wasn't supposed to and come back. He lied about whether his wife was actually his wife or not, and all these issues. He was an imperfect man, but you know what he did have? He did have trust in God and faith to believe that God was going to work all things together for good, because he knew he was called according to his purposes. Okay, so Abraham and Isaac get back, and we know that Isaac grows up, and Abraham goes and finds a wife for him. He finds this woman named Rachel, and Isaac and Rachel end up getting married. And Rachel and Isaac, guess what? Just like Isaac's parents, Rachel is barren. And we see the same pattern repeating itself, the same confirmation of that God is going to make a great nation out of Abraham, that this covenantal promise has passed from one generation to the next, from Abraham to Isaac, and that it was going to be on God to fulfill his promises. You see, the Abrahamic Covenant was two things. It was eternal and it was irrevocable. God had established this covenant in such a way with Abraham that nothing was going to keep it from happening. That this covenant extended into the eternal because it had to do with the Messiah. And that this covenant was irrevocable because even Abraham wasn't in control of the completion and fulfillment of this covenant. That God was the one who was going to make sure that it was completed. You're like, wow, that's a pretty incredible promise, right? But we'll find that the nation of Israel is disobedient. The nation of Israel from time to time does not abide by their part in the covenant, the Abrahamic covenant with God. But the covenant doesn't cease to exist. What actually ends up happening is from time to time, the blessings of the covenant will skip over generations, like maybe a generation in the wilderness that wanders before going into the promised land for 40 years. That if the nation was disobedient, that under the context of the Abrahamic covenant, because it was irrevocable, because it was eternal, that the blessings of God were still in force because they were dependent upon God's righteousness to fulfill, but that those blessings would actually skip a generation until they found a person that would respond in faith like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had. So Isaac ends up marrying Rachel. They're barren. God's going to fulfill this covenant. They do end up conceiving. And as a matter of fact, they conceive twins. Rachel understands that she's got twin babies, twin boys in her womb, and these two are going at it before they're even born. They're butting heads. And she goes to God and she asks him, God, what's going on here? You know, what's going on inside of me? And God says, you know what? You have two nations inside of your womb. And the older is actually going to serve the younger. So she gets this prophetic picture. And when she gives birth, the two babies she has are Jacob and Esau. And maybe you're familiar with the story of Jacob and Esau, two brothers. There's some significant things about the character of Jacob that I want to point out here. It's significant about the context in which Jacob and Esau and their relationship evolved. You know that Jacob was, it says that he was a man of the tents. He liked to hang out with mom. You know, maybe he was a good chef. I don't know. And back then it wasn't a manly thing to cook, I guess. You know, who knows what that meant in that context, except that he wasn't a manly man, right? And Esau was the opposite. He's just all hairy, you know, this thick red hair everywhere. Loved to hunt and kill stuff. Loved to get out there, big, burly, brawny. Painting this picture for you, right? And Isaac loved Esau. He was just a man's man. He was his dad's favorite. And Jacob was kind of like this, man, I'm not sure about that guy, you know? He's kind of always hanging out around the tents and stuff, and he seems more comfortable, you know, kind of doing the things that manly men don't do. So there's this really interesting dynamic. You can imagine Jacob and Esau growing up and just the tension between the two of them. Well, as they grow up, and it comes the time for the blessing of their father to be passed down, we see that Jacob's mom, Rachel, remembers this prophecy of the two sons in her womb, and she conspires with her son Jacob to steal both the blessing and the birthright from the oldest son, Esau. Now, here's the difference, and it may help you to understand kind of the story and how it evolves. You see, Esau goes out to hunt, and Jacob, you know, some have said his name means supplanter or deceiver. He's kind of a crafty kind of guy. And so he decides that what he's going to do is kind of position himself in the place where we can assume Esau usually came back after hunting for a long time. And like what usually happens, Esau comes back from one of his hunts and he happens to be famished, just dying of hunger. And lo and behold, guess what? Well, there's his brother Jacob, just sitting right there, making this big bowl of stew, and it just happens to be Esau's favorite stew. Well, what do you know, look at that. How do you imagine that'll happen? Jacob is positioned right there for this, and when Esau comes up, Esau's like, man, give me a bowl of that stew. And Jacob barters with him and says, look, you know what? I want you to give me your birthright for a bowl of this stew. I'll trade you. I'll give you some stew so you don't die from hunger, and then you give me your birthright. And what's Esau's response? He's like, sure, whatever, you can have it. Eats his stew and goes along on his merry way. Now you may think, that's pretty interesting. Why would Esau do something like that? And it really speaks to the character of Esau and the character of Jacob. Now Jacob's kind of a, you know, wheelie-dealy kind of guy. And Esau is just a straightforward, you know, in your face. So aside from their, you know, their personality types, let's look at this story in the context of their character and what it really means. And when God looks at these two people, what he sees. Because God doesn't look at the outside. God looks at the inside. And so we can look on the outside, like maybe Isaac did, and see his oldest son Esau, just a man's man. I love that guy, right? And he sees his son Jacob, and he's like, man, I love him, but he's just a little weird. I don't get him, you know? Or we look at Jacob, and we see, this guy's just a wheeler and a dealer, you know? He's just always kind of trying to cut corners and make it happen and you know, get a little extra out of everything. Esau is just straightforward. So we would look on the outside, but God sees the inside. God sees the heart. Now, to help you understand what God is seeing here, we need to understand the difference between both the birthright and the blessing, because they were very different in Old Testament times. You see, the birthright, the thing that Esau sold for just a bowl of stew, was the right for the oldest son of the family to, when the father died, have a double portion of the inheritance. So all of his wealth gets divided, the oldest gets 2 parts of it, right? That's one thing. And then the second thing is for them to be the head of the clan. They'll be the one that carries the authority and manages all the affairs. Well, Esau likes to hunt. Esau is a man's man. He doesn't want to be tied down with managing his dad's affairs after his dad goes. And who cares about a double portion of the birthright? Because Esau knows that he has the blessing, that his dad knows he's his favorite, he knows it's his dad's favorite, and his dad's going to bless him before he dies. The blessing, very different from the birthright. The blessing is the connection to the Abrahamic Covenant. The blessing is that thing that says, what God gave to Abraham and gave to me, I'm going to give to you. And so when Isaac put the blessing on his son, then what he was doing was saying, God is going to bless you. God is going to give you everything that he's going to do for his favor in your life. He's going to multiply you. He's going to increase you. And not only that, but he's going to do something eternal through you. Now we know the Messiah would come through them. So Esau's like, man, you can keep the birthright. I don't care about none of that. I know I'm getting the blessing. And Jacob and Rachel conspire by all kinds of deceptive methods to even steal the blessing from Esau. Esau was pretty ticked off about this, so much so that he was out for blood with his brother. He said, I'm going to kill my brother. If I ever get a hold of him, I'm going to tear him apart. But Jacob leaves. He has to flee into exile to his uncle's house far away, but he gets both the birthright and the blessing. Now Jacob didn't go about it the right way, right? Like his father before him, or his grandfather before him, Abraham, he tried to see God's promises fulfilled under his own power, and it creates a mess for him. His uncle is actually a better wheeling dealer than Jacob is, right? If Jacob was good at cutting corners, his uncle Laban is even twice as good. He tricks Jacob into marrying his older daughter that Jacob wasn't even into before he could even marry his younger daughter. And all these crazy things, you're probably familiar with those stories, gets him to work for 14 years, all this stuff going on. You know, it's really true that you reap what you sow. And we see that Jacob, in his effort, you know, to kind of make things happen under his own power, has a really tough time in life for a long time. But aside from all of that, God was looking directly to the heart of these two people. And when he looked at Esau, he saw a person that just didn't care. He didn't care about the birthright. He didn't care about the people in his life. He didn't care about God's promises. He just wanted himself. He just wanted to focus on what was important to him and to choose his own way and to do his own thing. And when God looked at Jacob, yeah, maybe he was messed up. Maybe he made a lot of mistakes. But when we see things like when Jacob wrestles with the angel and he says, I'm not going to let go till you bless me, we see that the heart of Jacob, even though he has all kinds of problems on the exterior, that the heart of Jacob was a heart after God. That it was a heart that wanted the blessings of God, so much so that he would go to the risk of estranging his own family, deceiving his own father, stealing something from his own brother just to get it. In contrast with Esau, who's like, whatever, I don't really care about all that. If you study the genealogy of Esau, you see that he becomes the father of the Edomites, which become enemies of the nation of Israel. As a matter of fact, the book Obadiah is written as a book against the Edomites and their judgment. And that Esau and his descendants are constantly not a people who have a heart after God. It's just the course that they took. And in contrast, Jacob and all his descendants do have a heart for God. Now Jacob has 12 sons. You know, Simon, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, and all down the line, Zebulun, these great men. And his next to last son is Joseph, his youngest son. And you know the story of Joseph. And so we're going to talk about this incredible story of Joseph as we close out the patriarchal period. So if you would turn to me in Genesis, go ahead and turn towards the end there. And we'll go to Genesis chapter, actually what we'll do is we'll back up to chapter 37 in Genesis here as we close out the book of Genesis and we look at Joseph. So Jacob, which is such an example of how no matter how messed up we may be on the exterior, if we'll submit our life to God, that God will do something beautiful through us and establish his will and purpose and plans despite our imperfections. And so Jacob has these 12 sons. The 11th is Joseph. The youngest is Benjamin, another one that's added to them. And Joseph ends up having these dreams about his greatness, right? You're familiar with that. And Jacob loves this son because Jacob loves his wife so much, kind of like the wife that he loved more than all the rest. Jacob actually had quite a few wives. And so his beloved wife gives him a son, Joseph, and then later Benjamin. And so he really establishes this great relationship with Joseph and lavishes this favor upon him and gives him this beautiful coat of many colors. Why that's important is, I mean, back in the Old Testament time, it's a big deal to dye material, you know, and so a coat that had multiple colors, I mean, that's a treasured possession. And so, of course, all of Joseph's brothers are like, man, what's going on with this guy? Why does Dad have such preference over him? You know, what are we? You know, chopped liver. And so, to make it even worse, to give you the context as to why Joseph's brothers really despise this kid, is because when Joseph has these dreams, he doesn't kind of process God's vision for his life and kind of keep it between him and God until the right time to reveal it. Instead, he just rushes out and says, man, you'll never believe what God told me. Y'all are going to serve me. You're going to bow down to me, even my mom and dad. Now, his dad is like, whoa, 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 whoa. You don't want to go around talking and saying things like that. You know, you're going to cause some problems. But his brothers, after hearing that, they're not as gracious. They're like, that's it. We're fed up to here with our little brother. And they despise him. They conspire, most all of them, to really try and kill him. His dad sends him out, Joseph out to find his brothers when they're out shepherding and doing what they were doing to care for the family fortune and all of that. Joseph comes along, and all the brothers except for Reuben and Judah want to kill him. And Reuben and Judah, they convince them all to throw him in a pit. And then when these Midianites, this group of slave traders come by that are going off into another area of the nation and all of that, they decide to sell Joseph to them. Now, Joseph is an incredible example of God working through impossible situations. What we see about Joseph, and remember, God doesn't look on the outside. He looks at our heart. We saw it with Abraham. We saw it with Isaac. We saw it with Jacob. And once again, we see it with Joseph, the promised son that follows the line here. We see that no matter what was thrown at him, whether he was thrown in prison, whether he was falsely accused, like with Potiphar's wife, no matter what happened, that he was constantly making sure that his heart was right before God, that no matter what came down the way to him in his life, that he was determined that he was going to acknowledge God as sovereign and glorify God and keep a proper attitude with him. God honors that. And at right around 30 years old, Joseph becomes the ruler of Egypt, which at the time is the most powerful nation in the world. As a matter of fact, in the context of world history, the pyramids had been long built by now. Maybe hundreds of years the pyramids had already been built. So have you ever thought of that? If you ever go to Egypt and you see the pyramids, that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob actually saw those very same pyramids when they were walking here on planet Earth. Isn't that pretty incredible? Just ancient structures. So Joseph is there in Egypt, and he's given this authority over this incredible nation, which is the greatest nation on the face of the earth at the time. And he's used by God to save the entire world from a famine. Pharaoh has this dream. Joseph interprets the dream. He's elevated to a place and position of authority, and then he's able to bless all the world, right? Think of the Abrahamic Covenant continuing to be fulfilled here, that God is going to bless the world and the nations through Abraham's seed. And here it is, in fact, with Joseph. Well, Joseph misses his family. He's been gone for a long time. And so what he does is he sends for his father and his brothers and the family, and he brings them all into Egypt. That's how Israel ends up in Egypt. They end up in Egypt during the time of Joseph's authority and Joseph's rule as the second in command of the entire nation of Egypt. What's significant about that is that as they come into Egypt, and the story is right there towards the end of Genesis, we see that it's only Jacob's family. That first God calls Abraham, one person, and he begins to build a nation. And then it's Isaac, then it's Jacob, and now it's Joseph. And now we have a family of about 75 people that have come into the nation of Egypt. And God establishes them there, prospers them there, and hundreds of years go by. And what we have now is this nation tucked within a nation. Now, what's cool is that God's purpose for bringing them to Egypt was really to protect them, because physically, Egypt is the greatest nation in the world, so no one is going to attack Jacob and his family of 75 people who have incredible wealth. Think of all the raiders and stuff like that would look down at Jacob and all of his wealth and think, man, I can take them. Well, God had brought them to Egypt to protect them physically, but also in a pure way, morally and spiritually, because the Egyptians were pretty kind of high society types. They didn't like to associate with shepherds. And who were Jacob and his family? They were all shepherds. The entire nation of Israel were kind of salt of the earth, shepherds. And so really you wouldn't have a lot of intermarrying between the Egyptians and the Israelites. So they would be preserved as a nation morally and then even spiritually, because there wouldn't be a connection there. And that's how the nation of Israel ends up in Egypt, and are incredibly blessed by Joseph as he fulfills his reign there and lives 110 years. And Joseph, before he dies, makes one final request. And his request in Genesis chapter 50, verse 25, is really a prophetic request. And I'm going to read it to you here, and we'll see how it's fulfilled. Genesis chapter 50 and verse 25, it says, "Then Joseph says to his brothers," in verse 24, "I'm about to die, but God will surely come to your aid and take you up out of this land to the land he promised an oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." You see, Joseph knew that God was going to call his people out of Egypt. Hundreds of years before Moses even shows up on the scene, Joseph prophesies of that day. And he says, you know what, when you go, I want you to take my bones with you, because I don't want to be left here in Egypt. I want to go with my people, with God's people, to the land that was promised to my great-great-grandfather Abraham. Isn't that powerful? Isn't that cool? Joseph's life, as well as Jacob's, as well as Isaac's, as so many of these patriarchs, was a typical example of Jesus Christ, the one that saves the world, the one that goes before us. And so as you continue in your study of the Old Testament, as continue in your study of these characters, look at these things through the lens of God revealing to us his purpose and plan of redemption as it unfolds throughout history and time. It's really an exciting thing. And so now we have, before we get into Exodus in the next section of our study here, we have the nation of Israel tucked away in the nation of Egypt, protected. What I want to point out is that to have a nation, you really need three things. You need people, you need a place, some land, and you really need some kind of a constitution or a law. Right now what we have is we have the formation and the beginning of a people, and God wants to create a nation out of Abraham and his descendants. So you're going to see this thing take shape and form as we get further and further into the story of the Old Testament. Hope you're enjoying it, and I can't wait to be with you next time in the next session.